Okay, it's now my pleasure to introduce Holly Replogle-Wong, my old friend. She's not the old one, I'm the old one. Holly Replogle-Wong is a lecturer in musicology at the University of California, Los Angeles, and the program director of the UCLA Center for Musical Humanities. She has taught courses on film music, popular music, American musical theater, and Western music history at UC Berkeley, Chapman University, and at UCLA. She's also a regular speaker for the LA Opera Connects educational outreach program. Her research interests include topics in musical theater, voice fandom studies, and 20th century American culture. Cultural hierarchies, classical crossovers, and film and video game music. She has directed musical theater productions at UCLA and primary and secondary schools, and sung with various vocal ensembles for the occasional film soundtrack, and has performed in musical theater presentations in Los Angeles area. So would you please welcome Dr. Holly Replogle-Wong.
All right. Thank you, Tim. All right. In his youth, musician and media personality Oscar Levant was known among his entertainment friends, colleagues, and enemies as an enfant terrible for his outrageous wit, behavior, and devil-may-care approach to his career as a pianist. He worked a series of jobs as a musician in Hollywood and on Broadway, playing piano, conducting, composing, contributing a standard to the American Songbook, the 1934 song Blame It on My Youth, with lyrics by Edward Heyman. And his local notoriety, that is in LA, in New York and LA, as a personality, launched into a nationwide persona as he became a popular regular on the radio quiz show Information Please in the 1940s. He appeared in several feature films, playing what could be and typically was construed by the general public as a version of himself. Later in his career, as he was at the height of his national celebrity as a combination of a concert pianist, film actor, and media personality, Levant's finely honed humor of verbal punches taken at celebrities, tempered by a public self-deprecation, seemed to merge with the ways in which he publicly frames his struggles with addiction and mental illness. Between the mid-1950s through the 1960s, his hospitalizations were a frequent news item. There was a false report by the LA Times in February of 1954 of an attempted suicide, which they retracted, but the damage was done, and this helped to cement the new public persona. Vicente Minnelli cast Levant in what would be his final film role, once again playing something of a version of himself as a patient in a mental hospital in the 1955 film The Cobweb. Levant continued to be in the public eye through the mid-1960s, likely motivated in part by necessity to support his family, hosting his own local television program in Los Angeles with his wife June, who is a former vaudevillian and a film actress. The show was called The Oscar Levant Show and was aired between 1958 and 1960. In addition to that, he made appearances on talk shows and published several memoirs. What we might refer to as Oscar Levant's star text is complex and unruly. Drawing on the phrase from Richard Dyer's work, Stars, a star's text is made up of all the media texts that are produced around that individual, and that, quote, the star persona is a public figure who is defined, often complexly and often with contradictions, in relation to the cultural politics and social practices of their time. So a star may reify the ideological status quo by reiterating or concealing dominant values, but he or she can also be a locus for resistance or subversion, a place of identification for a marginalized audience member. Levant is remembered mostly as a sort of tragic, troubled genius and a shadow of George Gershwin. What kinds of cultural work is performed then when you have a disruptive star text that demands attention on its own terms while also perpetually haunted by another text's past and that text's lost future? The purpose of this project is to reevaluate Oscar Levant's star text and his work in the context of recent scholarly developments and fan studies and disability studies as a way to grapple with this specter of the tragic genius while also situating him within the context of his cohort of Jewish American Tin Pan Alley and concert musicians and the complex artistic flows between popular and high art, past and present, and tensions between cultural forms and hierarchies that were constructed and challenged through America's early mid-century. And it appears I am not alone in this interest. Since I started this project about 2.5 years ago, there have been other works about Oscar Levant that have come forth. A couple of scholarly pieces, an article by Nathan Platt entitled The Problem of Playing Oneself, Oscar Levant and the Hollywood Musical, that appeared in the Oxford Handbook of the Hollywood Musical in 2021, a PhD dissertation by Caleb Taylor Boyd entitled Oscar Levant, Pianist, Gershwinite, and Middlebrow Media Star, and then perhaps most publicly, a play by Pulitzer and Tony Award-winning playwright Doug Wright entitled Goodnight Oscar, which premiered in Chicago in 2022 and then went on to Broadway in 2023 where it had 126 performances. It's a show about one of Oscar Levant's several infamous appearances on The Tonight Show with Jack Paar. This particular one in the play is from 1958, and I will return to this later. Levant's career in star text crossed multiple early and mid-20th century thresholds of cultural hierarchies, American identity, and discourses around being a public figure that, in our current age of social media celebrity, and finding and navigating the fine line between something like notoriety and cancellation, between abjection and empowerment, are all remarkably timely conversations to have. Oscar Levant, born in 1906, was a child of Russian Jewish parents. His father was a watchmaker who immigrated to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania in 1891 as part of the second wave of immigration, settling into an existing Jewish community in the Hill District. His mother was the daughter of a rabbi who had immigrated in 1890 as a teenager. She was religiously observant, kept a kosher home, and attended her father's synagogue. They had 4 sons, of whom Oscar was the youngest, but he was not the first or only son who made his way into show business. His older brother, Harry, was a conductor on Broadway, much to their parents' frustration for both of them. Oscar Levant moved to New York as a teenager to study piano and found work variously as a pianist in and around Broadway. He traveled to New York in 1928 to work adjacent to film, and this is where he met George Gershwin through Leonore or Lee Gershwin, who was married to Ira Gershwin. Much later in life, I found a letter in the USC archives where Levant compared her to being his Nadezhda von Meck, if you're familiar with Tchaikovsky's patron and supporter, compared Lee Gershwin to that kind of role in Levant's life. He assembled a career that cut across multiple forms of media and reached audiences across the slowly dissolving divides of American cultural hierarchies. One of the perhaps lesser-known things about Oscar Levant is that he studied with Arnold Schoenberg. He was invited by Aaron Copland to Yaddo in 1932 to take part in the first festival of contemporary American music, playing piano, but also a piece that he had written was programmed on the Saturday evening, a sonatina for piano and ensemble, and was programmed alongside Mark Blitzstein, Robert Russell Bennett, and Roy Harris. For a time, Levant was the highest paid concert pianist in the United States, more so than Horowitz and Rubinstein, all while being a radio and film personality in musical films playing himself, though as Nathan Platt argues in his recent piece on Oscar Levant, playing oneself is not necessarily as static a role as it would perhaps appear to be. Levant had a number of shared experiences with his friend George Gershwin, sons of Russian Jewish immigrants, brought up in neighborhoods in American cities that were Jewish immigrant neighborhoods, putting the religious observance their parents modeled aside as they navigated careers that brought them into the heart of Tin Pan Alley, a place where American Jewish songwriters were shaping what would become known as the American Songbook. But it was a prickly friendship. Two people in the same community with similar skill sets as pianists and composers. As such, the relationship frequently became competitive. For instance, a couple of anecdotes I've found. When Gershwin listened to Levant's recording of Rhapsody in Blue, the first recording of the piece released since George Gershwin's own, apparently Gershwin's only comment was, "I like mine better." Singer Kitty Carlisle, she was interviewed for Sam Kashner and Nancy Schoenberger's 1994 biography of Oscar Levant. She recalled meeting Levant at the Gershwins' house in LA for a Passover Seder, where Levant apparently presided over the Seder service and, quote, performed the whole ceremony in a kind of mad jazz rhythm. George, not to be outdone, chimed in, end quote. So while Gershwin's popular songs and concert works had the kind of popularity that Levant's never had, Levant had cred with the American high art crowd that Gershwin seemed to envy. But as composers, Levant seemed to accept that Gershwin won out because of his apparent facility with which he would write and cross musical idioms. Levant wrote a concerto for piano and orchestra in the 1930s, and this top excerpt here is a quote from a program note that Levant wrote for a performance with the Philadelphia Orchestra, starting with a typical self-deprecating quip. This music reflects an arrogance and pretentiousness based on an economic and emotional insecurity, and then kind of goes on to tangle through some more self-deprecating remarks before quoting at length a review by Virgil Thompson, which Thompson wrote at the premiere of this piece. Where Thompson writes, quote, "It is even beneath its trappings of schoolboy homage to Gershwin and Schoenberg, hard, lonely, and original music, full of song and solitude. I sometimes wish Levant would not work so hard at being a composer. He seems afraid to relax and let music write itself. But every man must scale Parnassus in his own way. Maybe the hard way is the only one he would feel right about taking." In a radio documentary produced many years later, around 1961, Levant will echo such sentiments in his own words. This is from, again, the radio documentary entitled George Gershwin Remembered, where the interviewers undertook several conversations and interviews with figures such as Fred Astaire, Ira Gershwin, and they did Oscar Levant's interview at the piano.
This is Oscar Levant speaking about Gershwin. Again. They said, just talk, Oscar. Give us Gershwin in your own words, sort of a profile, a portrait of the artist. I'll try. It's not an easy thing to do. When you try to describe genius, you get into trouble, and you deserve it. It's a frustrating subject. Well, there was nothing frustrated about George. There was no gap between his dream and his doing. No uncertainty. The music was there and it came out. Naturally, easily. He was a natural. That's a rare and fine thing to be. It's pretty marvelous when you stop to think about it. It shows up in George's music.
Actually for some time playing before he speaks again. So saying as much in his own words as, was reflected in some of these words here, while also acknowledging that as time goes on, such remembrances increasingly become the stuff of legend and informed by tropes of the legendary. After Gershwin's unexpected death in 1937, Levant became known publicly as a premier interpreter of Gershwin's piano works. However, this ambivalently sought and unsought responsibility resulted in one of Levant's many sort of facets of his star text becoming known as a surviving mouthpiece of another musician, a role that came to bear not just on his repertoire as a concert pianist, but on his output as a composer and a celebrity who was a living witness to a particular time, place, and circle of Jewish American music makers. Through a variety of texts, concert, film, radio, print, his presence at the piano makes him into a living memory, or perhaps something like a medium, a person who is a physical mediator of communication between spirits and living beings, a conduit through which the living can hear from the dead. Levant played Rhapsody in Blue at the September 8, 1937 memorial concert at the Hollywood Bowl, and this was a moment that was recreated with an added melodramatic twist in the Gershwin biopic from 1945, Rhapsody in Blue, directed by Urban Rapper. So in the final scene of the film, we have Oscar Levant at the Hollywood Bowl playing Rhapsody in Blue, as he did in real life. We zoom in as he plays, and then we cut to Joan Leslie, the actress playing George Gershwin's fictional love interest in the film. The camera moves into extreme close-up on her face and blurs. She blinks, and we come into focus on her face and an Oscar Levant who becomes increasingly more blurry before fading into Robert Alda as Gershwin. But we continue to hear Levant's recording of Rhapsody in Blue. The living body at the piano is blurred off the screen, but continuing to act as the still living voice of a ghost. I find my mind increasingly, as I think about this sort of odd filmic moment, increasingly turning to the twists and turns of the difficult to define concept of hauntology, which was a neologism coined by Jacques Derrida in the 1990s, combining haunt with ontology. His intent was an aim towards a critique of Marxist temporality, and since then it's a term that has been co-opted by music scholars like Simon Reynolds and Martin Fisher to apply to musical practices as a way to describe music that is preoccupied with retro aesthetics and also a nostalgia for lost futures. As Martin Fisher elaborates, quote, that which in actuality is no longer, but which is still effective as a virtuality. The second refers to that which in actuality has not yet happened, but which is already effective in the virtual. So when Reynolds and Fisher are kind of grappling with this idea of defining hauntology, thinking about the specter that is not fully present, has no being in and of itself, but marks a relation to that which is no longer or not yet. They are concerned with recording technology. As Fisher writes, quote, postmodern time presupposes ubiquitous recording technology, but postmodernity screens out the spectrality, naturalizing the uncanniness of the recording apparatuses. Hauntology restores the uncanniness of the recording by making the recorded surface audible again and inciting examples of artists who foreground sounds, for instance, sampled sounds of vinyl crackle on a recording. He continues to write, there is no attempt to smooth away the textural discrepancy between the crackly sample and the rest of the recording. If the metaphysics of presence rests on the privileging of speech in the here and now, then the metaphysics of crackle is about dyschronia and disembodiments. Crackle unsettles the very distinction between surface and depth, between background and foreground. In sonic hauntology, we hear that time is out of joint, end quote. Through visual sleight of hand in film, the uncanny is manipulated to disorienting melodramatic ends. We see time falling out of joint, even as the audio remains stable, something like the reverse reveal, I suppose, like a reverse of the reveal of a singer overdubbing a star from backstage. The audio and visual fail to align in a totality that emphasizes that which is no longer. And I note a persistent strain in the removal and replacement of the physical body in Levant's texts having to do with Gershwin, even ones where he had more authorship than, say, a feature film. His concert piece, Dirge, completed in 1937, initially had nothing to do with Gershwin. Levant was living in Hollywood, working variously at film studios, writing some film scores, taking lessons with Arnold Schoenberg, and he produced a handful of pieces, most for piano and orchestra, for him to play at the premieres, as befitted his skills. As Levant noted, quote, George was greatly intrigued and faintly annoyed by the obtruseness of the music I was writing, so sharply different from his own. So doing something that he felt was sort of markedly different from the kind of music that had made his colleagues so famous. He was composing a 3-movement piece for orchestra when Gershwin passed away, at which point Levant scrapped his original plans for the second movement, which was originally going to be a theme and variation slow movement, and then replaced it with a new idea that he titled Dirge and dedicated to Gershwin. This new second movement he wrote in 8 days, film composer time, I would say. And he did not write this for piano, so removing his sort of performative voice out of it in that respect. This was something that was only for orchestra. And the work was premiered by the Pittsburgh Orchestra in 1939 with Levant conducting. But he was also on that same program performing Gershwin's Concerto in F, seated at the piano. The piece, just a little bit about the piece. It took some time to track down a copy of the score. The principal theme was designed to resemble a blues tune. And from there, that develops into a series of thematic rhythms that layer into very complex exchanges between lower and higher strings, and also between strings and winds generally, eventually reaching a consensus of rhythmic effort before fading away into the soft distance from where it began with the same sort of funeral march-like tattoo coming out of the timpani. So the debt to Schoenberg and Gershwin that Virgil Thomson detected in the piano concerto, you might argue, are here too. After the premiere of this piece, the second movement, Dirge, was the one that continued to get more programming on other concerts, not with the other 2 movements that it was included among. So later on, the Cleveland Symphony Orchestra, the Boston Symphony Orchestra, the Philadelphia Orchestra, and I have not found an archive score of the other movements. I suspect this movement was the most audience accessible, since there is a general reluctance on the part of orchestras to program an entire new work, of course. Plus, you have this particular movement that was dedicated to Gershwin by Levant, and so there's a relationship with the star text there. And the Boston program definitely plays this up. There are program notes in there from Levant talking about his relationship with Gershwin. Now, I have not found any more performances of this piece after the 1940s, but I did find a performance of the piece in 1981 that took place at Royce Hall during a marathon of concert pieces by LA-based composers. The 2 headliner composers featured on this marathon were, of course, Stravinsky and Schoenberg. Levant was included on the program, as you can see, just after a piece by Gershwin. And once again, the bio notes for Oscar Levant in this program tend toward an explication of his relationship to Gershwin. So once again, Levant's work here in the composition Dirge becomes an ongoing source of paratexts on Gershwin. I'm citing fandom studies here with the term paratext, as Jonathan Gray points out in his work on fandom. quote, the promotional and referential materials that transport media texts and fan objects across a culture is the very stuff upon which popular interpretation is based. So the paratext, whether in film, an interview, recording, or inclusion in concert repertory, ends up kind of performing something of a persistent haunting or presence of Gershwin. And I'll continue to take this idea a bit further when we talk about musical film. Levant goes on to play roles in film, several musical films that provide easy narrative opportunities for him to sit at a piano and play on screen. In 1951, he had a role in the MGM musical An American in Paris, directed by Vicente Minnelli, featuring songs that had been written by George and Ira Gershwin, and of course the concert piece from which the film gets its title. Levant plays a version of himself, gifted, witty, cantankerous, underachieving, while also fulfilling the role of being the film's Gershwin mediator and authenticator. As Vicente Minnelli wrote in his memoirs, quote, "We thought of no one but Oscar Levant for the part of Jerry's sidekick, Adam Cook. Including Oscar in the film lent the enterprise a sort of legitimacy, though he would have blanched if I'd told him that." So I will show you his feature in this film. Just out of curiosity, how many of you are familiar with this clip? Oh, many of you are. Okay. Playing the third movement of Gershwin's Concerto in F with an orchestra, but with a bit of a twist. Okay, in the interest of time, but I will note that at the end of this particular performance, it's also himself in the audience, loudly applauding the performance. So a few notes on how this scene came to be. While the producer, MGM producer Arthur Freed, insisted on Levant being present in the film, Levant had concerns that Freed would be resistant to there being a lengthy musical feature for him. As the Freed unit, as it was called during this time, was moving toward the so-called integrated musical formula of song and dance, needing to have some kind of plot purpose rather than halting the forward motion of a musical's narrative in order for there to be a star turn like this. So Levant ended up meeting with Vicente Minnelli and pitched the idea that he be filmed playing all the instruments in the orchestra. And it ends up, selling quite well, and obviously it made it to the film. In the film, Levant is rarely seen away from the piano. It is both the source of his purpose in the film and also his trap. And this is something that Minnelli frames with his, sort of typical melancholic flair, especially in this scene where you have Oscar Levant as Adam Cook smoking a cigarette, sort of having this fantasy sequence where he imagines this, bravura performance, and then coming back to himself and reality, whistling a tune by Gershwin back again alone in his apartment. So it's a thorough sort of crushing of the ego through a cinematic act of self-deprecation. And given where it happens in the film, it is something like a punishment. This is right after his character sort of pokes at Gene Kelly's character with a misogynist verbal attack on Gene Kelly's character and his masculinity for entertaining a female art patron. Jerry leaves the apartment and is once again in motion all over Paris, while Adam Cook, Oscar Levant's character, is in his apartment next to an immovable piano just stuck. But in the broader context of Levant's star text surrounding the performance of Gershwin pieces, I'm compelled to start reading this scene in another way. The uncanniness of recorded reproduction enables a furious insistence upon his embodiment as a performer, whose physical labor continues to make this music sound. And it is Levant's embodiment that becomes ever more visible in this decade and the next, as his public struggles with mental health become all the more pronounced. Intertwined with this complex text of Gershwin is Levant's public persona, and his well-established strategies of audacity and self-deprecation are modes by which he became and continued to be a public celebrity, even as he was visibly ill. This intersection of strategy and unapologetic presence in his star text is a complex one to decipher. The ways in which bodily difference are stigmatized in his later career, which of course are thrown into greater relief by Levant's exceptional ability as a pianist, brings associations of the tragic genius mythology that haunt his surviving star text, a myth that leans heavily upon typical tropes in discourses of disability, that of overcoming. And Levant did not fulfill the overcoming narrative demanded by desires informed by conventional capitalist and ableist versions of the American dream. There was an incident on one of the episodes of the Oscar Levant show where Levant railed against one of the show's sponsors on air, and the show was briefly halted. Several letters of support were sent on his behalf to the television station and to local news, some of which took the opportunity to pontificate on the topics of honesty and sincerity in the medium of television with regard to this visible performance of mental illness. I have a letter here from Busby Berkeley. All the underlining are his own, where he writes, "It is refreshing to find someone who is really mad, but brilliantly mad." And then another letter from one of Levant's attending doctors, writing about this performance being something of a response to a cult of sincerity that he's perceiving, synthetically manufactured as a saleable product. So once again, considering Levant's presence as a resistance to the demands of capitalist decorum in a talk show. Now again, these defenses do fall within the mad genius metaphor, where work is both marred and ennobled by disability. And looking to the field of disability studies and ways of understanding the social, cultural, and political meanings of disability, Carrie Sandall and Philip Auslander argue, quote, "To think of disability not as a physical condition, but as a way of interacting with the world, a world that is frequently inhospitable, is to think of disability in performative terms, as something one does rather than something one is." So, end quote. An agent and an object, perhaps, framed by an audience. And we might think then about how narratives with regard to disability tend toward representations of mechanisms of cure, which can be medical, but also narratives of recuperation, transformation, and transcendence. And certainly Levant's continued presence as a celebrity indicates the subversive potential for difference to undermine convention, creating a, quote, commotion, as Sandall and Auslander refer to it as. Now, from what I have seen so far in my research, this seemed to be an ongoing negotiation, and one that Levant was, to some extent, willing to let happen in the public sphere. And this grapple with this sort of haunting of the, selfish haunting of the more famous that demands more paratexts from those that it haunts. This is a trope in continuation in the play Goodnight Oscar, which was written as a star vehicle for Sean Hayes, and he did win a Tony for Best Lead Actor in 2023. Most probably remember Sean Hayes from his time as Jack on the American TV sitcom Will and Grace, and had no idea that he had this level of training as a concert pianist. And it is an experience of revelation for the audience as they are taken through the last third of Rhapsody in Blue as part of this play. So this scene, I'm just going to show you a brief clip of this, takes place during a taping of the Jack Parr Show, the talk show that regularly had Levant appear, to the public pushback of some of those who did not want to see him on screen and visibly struggling. We have Sean Hayes as Oscar Levant performing a mental break where he sees the ghost of Gershwin, who shows up and forces him to play Rhapsody in Blue.
I got my own news, but my Rhapsody is tattooed on your soul, isn't it? Every last note. Almost like you wrote it yourself. For fuck's sake.
And it goes on, he completes the piece all the way to the end. So it's a tour de force, of course, for Hayes. But it's also a moment that is not without its humor, but it is a strain that is actually attempted to be acknowledged. The performance suggests that there's a genuine care for the music of Gershwin on the part of Levant's character here in the play, even as it is an ongoing source of frustration. At this point, Oscar Levant is a figure that is not well remembered. Reviewers of this play referred to him as an esoteric subject, which to some extent makes his function in the play perhaps bear a resemblance to something of a Salieri type in Peter Shaffer's play Amadeus. But of course, with this performance, we have yet another layering, another star text being brought into the midst of two other strong ones, and through live performance, yet another reevaluation taking place, and one I am still working to decipher as this project continues. So thank you.
All right, so we'll take a little time for a question or a comment.
Yeah, and I'm happy to chat over dinner, too, for further questions.
I'll make it quick. But first of all, thank you so much. That was really fascinating. And so I'm still getting my head around some of the concepts that you unveiled.
Me too.
I may want to ask you over dinner or later.
Yeah.
But a quick question. I saw the Fred Hacker quote, and through the entire talk, I was wondering when Hacker was going to come up. And I say this, and probably no one else in the room's heard of Hacker, but I'm writing about Hacker in another project.
Okay, we need to talk. Yeah, we need to talk.
So was Levant in treatment, and was he in treatment with Hacker?
He was in treatment with several different folks at that point. It was a sort of complex trading off that was happening at that point.
Okay,
So
we'll talk.
Yeah, we need to talk.
Yes.
Can I ask a really quick question? Really quickly. The quote that you use in the title of the piece that you presented today, where does that come from?
Oh, that's him. That's Levant.
I think I just missed it
Yeah,
as
let me
things
get
moved.
that back up.
Sorry. Yeah,
This is something
quote.
that comes from, he'll say this in interviews, this is something that he would say on talk shows, and it's also something that he puts in his memoirs. And there's a fair bit of overlap between things that he'll say, in public on talk shows, and then also included into the memoirs that he published that were very popular, bestseller kind of material. Yeah. Oh, David.
So you mentioned a mechanism of cure. It seems to me there's a mechanism of defense, a defense mechanism here, that he is socially ill at ease, He needs to have the shield of the piano. That's why the interview is there with the piano. I would love to get Leon's reaction to this. But the fact that this plays out on screen reminds me very much of Richard Burton in The Spy Who Came In From the Cold. The entire plot is that they have to make up a reason why he's left his post in Berlin, Cold War Berlin, so they play him up as this drunkard. But in fact, every place that he's taken after he's abducted, he's given the exact same brand of scotch, which apparently is the brand of scotch that Richard Burton drank every day. So it's that shield, which is also the trap. And for Levant, it seems to me that when you remove the shield and you remove the trap, you're left with self-deprecation. I'm sure that Leon has more to say, but I'd love to hear what you have to say about that as well.
And this is part of the reason, I mean, it is a mode of expression that clearly served him so well because he was able to parlay it into this kind of humor that ends up becoming part of his star text and is very popular. It's the kind of thing that, brings him back on talk shows and sells books and that sort of thing. So there's, this sort of economic facility that it affords him as well, right? This is part of the reason why I ended up spending so much time trying to track down a score to Dirge, because I was fascinated by, not only the sort of time in which it happens, the sort of abandoning of an earlier compositional project in order to do something that had to do with Gershwin, but coincided with the Schoenberg studies and didn't actually have a piano part in it. And again, I just got a hold of this score, so my work on it is just beginning. I have a very crappy, MIDI version that I punched into Sibelius, just so I can get a sense of what it sounded like. And Sibelius doesn't do it justice at all, because it is so, the rhythms are so finely wrought, and which makes me wonder how this, ends up coming across in an orchestra. And whether all of those articulations actually do successfully come across, or if it comes across in a more sort of perhaps muddy way, in a way that also has this kind of shield that is being performed as well. So again, that's sort of part of the ongoing thing. And if you are ever willing actually to look at the score to Dirge, David, I would love to hear your thoughts.
That's any more hands, so thank you, Holly.
Thank you.